The gold band on Zara's finger felt like a lead weight as Dae-hyun quietly locked the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse suite. The click of the bolt echoed through the room, a sharp punctuation mark to a day of choreographed lies. Zara set her small clutch on the marble vanity, her shoulders aching from the hours spent maintaining the perfect, adoring posture of a Mafia bride. Behind them, the sounds of the celebration, the clinking of crystal, and the low, predatory hum of the syndicate's elite still vibrated through the floorboards. But in here, the air was cold and sterile. "You can take it off now," Dae-hyun said, his voice as flat as a blade. He stood by the window, his back to her, a silhouette of silver hair and broad shoulders wrapped in expensive black silk. He began unbuttoning his shirt, revealing the intricate ink that crawled up his neck and down his spine, a map of a life Zara was only beginning to understand. "The contract said separate rooms," Zara reminded him, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "But your men are stationed at every exit. I'm not exactly going anywhere." Dae-hyun turned slightly, the moonlight catching the hard line of his jaw. "There's been a change of plans. My uncle's men didn't just attend the wedding to toast our health. They're here to verify if the rumors are true. They believe I am weak, Zara. They believe I am incapable of producing an heir." He gestured toward the massive, untouched bed in the center of the room. "You cannot leave this room tonight. If you walk out to the guest suite, the coup begins before sunrise." Zara looked at the bed, and then back at the man who had bought her life to save his throne. "So we sleep here? Together?" "We stay on opposite sides," Dae-hyun replied, his eyes showing a flash of something that wasn't power. It was a deep, buried fear. "I will not cross that line. I cannot." The way he said "cannot" hung in the air, confirming the secret Zara had been hired to hide. The most dangerous man in Seoul was powerless behind closed doors. She realized then that this wasn't just a business transaction. It was a desperate defensive play. Outside that door, the uncles were waiting for a single sign of friction, a single hint that the marriage was a hollow shell. "Then we make them believe it," Zara said, stepping toward the bed and pulling back the heavy silk duvet. She watched as Dae-hyun's hand trembled slightly as he set his watch on the nightstand. He was a king in the streets, but in this room, he was a man trapped in a gold-plated cage of his own trauma. As they lay in the dark, separated by a vast expanse of expensive linen, Zara could hear his jagged breathing. Every creak of the building felt like a threat, a reminder that their lives now depended on the perfection of their performance. The contract was falling apart on day one, and as the city lights flickered outside, Zara knew that surviving the Mafia was going to be the easy part. Surviving the proximity to Dae-hyun's secret would be the real battle. 3 weeks before the silver and silk deception of the wedding, Zara's world was defined by the scent of lemon polish and the rhythmic scrub of a brush against marble. As a maid in the sprawling Han estate, she was a ghost in the periphery, a shadow that moved through the hallways of power without ever leaving a footprint. Her life was a grueling cycle of labor, driven by the crushing weight of a family debt that felt like a noose tightening with every passing month. While the elite of Seoul's underworld discussed blood and territory in the rooms she cleaned, Zara focused on the dust, knowing that for people like her, being noticed was often a death sentence. The night that changed everything began like any other, under the oppressive hum of the estate's industrial kitchen. Zara had been assigned to the private study, a room most of the staff feared because it belonged to Dae-hyun, the heir apparent whose reputation for cold brutality was matched only by his silence. She was polishing the heavy oak desk when the door swung open, and the silver-haired boss strode in, his face a mask of restrained fury. He wasn't alone. He was trailed by 2 lieutenants who were mid-argument, their voices rising with news of a leaked medical report and the growing insolence of the district uncles. Zara dropped her gaze immediately, retreating to the corner with her head bowed, trying to become part of the furniture. But the argument escalated. One lieutenant, desperate to prove a point, slammed a folder onto the desk, the papers sliding across the wood. The tension in the room snapped like a dry branch. Dae-hyun caught sight of Zara, his eyes narrowing as if he had just realized a witness was standing in his sanctum. "Leave us," he barked at his men. When the door clicked shut, the silence was more terrifying than the shouting had been. Dae-hyun approached her, his presence a physical weight, his tattooed hand reaching out to tilt her chin upward. Most people flinched or looked away when confronted by the monster of soul, but Zara didn't. She looked him directly in the eyes, her expression a calm, unblinking sea of defiance and exhaustion. She had seen the worst of humanity in the gutters of the city. A man with silver hair and an expensive suit didn't scare her half as much as the eviction notice sitting in her apron pocket. "You don't blink," Dae-hyun murmured, his voice a low vibration. He didn't see a maid. He saw a woman who could stare into the sun and not flinch. He saw the dignity under pressure that his empire desperately lacked. "I don't have the luxury of closing my eyes, Mr. Han," she replied quietly. He let go of her chin, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. He reached into his desk and pulled out a folder, not of cleaning schedules, but of a contract that offered more money than Zara had ever seen in her life. It was a ticket out of the dust, a chance to trade her rags for diamonds, provided she was willing to lie to the world and marry a man who couldn't even stand to touch his own reflection. "I don't need a maid anymore," he said, pushing the papers toward her. "I need a shield. I need a wife who can look my enemies in the eye and make them believe she loves a monster." Zara looked at the numbers on the page, then at the lonely, broken man standing before her. She picked up the pen, and with one stroke, the girl from the dust began her ascent to the throne. The transition from the basement quarters to the master wing was like moving between two different planets. Zara's new world was a sprawling expanse of glass, polished chrome, and silence, situated at the highest point of the Han estate. But as she stood in the center of her private dressing room, surrounded by racks of hand-stitched silk and shelves of shoes that cost more than her mother's medical bills, the opulence felt less like a reward and more like a tactical deployment. She was no longer Zara the maid. She was the centerpiece of a high-stakes psychological war. Dae-hyun moved through the suite like a ghost in his own home. He never raised his voice, and he never entered her room without a sharp clinical knock that signaled the start of another briefing. On the third morning of their arrangement, he stood by the balcony, the light catching the silver of his hair and the dark ink of the dragon coiled around his forearm. He held a leather-bound folio, the revised Conduct of Domestic Engagement. "There are 3 rules that are non-negotiable," he said, his voice as cold as the morning mist over the Han River. "First, in the presence of my family or the press, you are the only person I trust. You will sit to my right, you will touch my arm when I speak, and you will look at me as if you know my every secret and love me for them." Zara adjusted the heavy gold watch on her wrist, its weight a constant reminder of the price she had accepted. "And the second rule?" Dae-hyun finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting a profound, weary distance. "In private, we do not exist to each other. You have your wing, I have mine. You do not enter my study unless invited, and you never, under any circumstances, attempt to initiate physical contact when the doors are closed. My space is my own. If you breach that boundary, the contract is void." Zara felt the sting of the rejection, not because she desired him, but because of the sheer clinical coldness with which he spoke. He was treating her like a dangerous chemical, necessary for the reaction, but toxic to the touch. "You make it sound like I'm a specimen in a jar, Dae-hyun. I'm a human being, not a prop." "You are a partner in a deception," he corrected, his jaw tightening. "The third rule is the most important. You must never pity me. My uncles will look for a crack in our facade. If they see you looking at me with anything other than pride, they will know I am compromised. They will know I am broken." The word hung heavy between them, when a rare moment of honesty that seemed to drain the air from the room. To the world, he was the untouchable sovereign of the streets, but within the silver cage of the penthouse, he was a man guarding a void. Zara realized then that the no-touch policy wasn't about a lack of desire, it was about a desperate need for control. Every inch of his skin was covered in tattoos, stories of pain and triumph, yet he couldn't bear the weight of a single, genuine human hand. As the days bled into weeks, Zara learned to navigate the silence. She learned which wines he preferred to keep for show, and which medications he tucked into the back of his nightstand. She wore the diamonds like armor and practiced her adoring gaze in the mirror until it looked real. But every time their eyes met in the quiet hallway, the distance between them felt less like a policy and more like a tragedy. She was a queen in a palace of glass, ruling over a kingdom of secrets, waiting for the moment the first stone would be thrown. The smell of ozone and copper hit Zara before the elevator doors even finished sliding open. It was well past midnight, and the penthouse, usually a sanctuary of sterile perfection, felt suddenly violated by the harsh, uneven breathing echoing from the foyer. Dae-hyun was slumped against the mahogany console, his white dress shirt shredded and soaked a deep, terrifying crimson. His silver hair was matted with grit, and the dragon tattoo on his forearm was bisected by a jagged, weeping gash that dripped rhythmically onto the marble floor. "Get back to your room," he wheezed, his voice a gravelly ghost of its usual authority. He tried to push himself upright, but his boots skidded in his own blood, and he let out a sharp, hissed intake of breath that sounded like tearing silk. Zara didn't move toward her room. Instead, she moved toward the kitchen, her mind switching from Mafia queen back to the practical, unflinching woman who had spent years stitching together a life on the fringes. She returned a moment later with a basin of warm water, antiseptic, and a roll of clean bandages. When she knelt beside him, Dae-hyun recoiled as if she held a brand. "Rule 2, Zara," he growled, his eyes clouded with pain but still flashing with that desperate defensive fire. "No touch. No intimacy. Rule 2 is for when you're not bleeding out on my floor," Zara countered, her voice low and steady, when the unblinking gaze that had won her the contract now fixed on the wound. "If you die tonight, the contract is void anyway, and I haven't been paid in full." It was a lie. She cared more than the money, but it was the only language he seemed to respect. Slowly, the tension drained from his frame, and he slumped back against the wood, his head thumping against the wall. He closed his eyes, a silent, agonizing surrender. Zara worked with a clinical efficiency that masked the frantic hammering of her heart. As she cut away the ruined silk of his shirt, the full extent of his armor was revealed. His chest was a living gallery of ink, traditional motifs of waves, tigers, and shadows that fought for space among a history of scars. But as she pressed a warm cloth to his side to clear the gore, she felt the involuntary tremor that rippled through his muscles. It wasn't just the pain of the wound, it was the electricity of the contact. For the first time since the wedding, the air between them wasn't cold. It was scorching. "You're shaking," she whispered, her fingers light as she applied the antiseptic. "I told you," he muttered, his jaw clamped so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. I don't do this. It's just skin, Dae-hyun. It's just a body." Zara moved her hand to his shoulder to steady him as she began to wrap the gauze. Beneath the ink, his skin was fever-hot. For a fleeting second, his hand hovered near hers, his fingers twitching as if wanting to grasp her wrist, to pull her closer or push her away. He didn't seem to know which. The silence in the room was no longer the empty silence of a cage. It was the heavy, charged silence of a storm about to break. As Zara tied off the bandage, she realized she was leaning in, her breath fluttering against the hollow of his throat. Dae-hyun's eyes snapped open, looking at her with a raw vulnerability that no tattoo could hide. The monster of soul was gone, replaced by a man who looked terrified of the very comfort he was finally receiving. She withdrew her hand slowly, the absence of his heat leaving her fingers feeling unnaturally cold. The boundary had been breached, not by desire, but by necessity. And as she looked at the blood staining her own hands, she knew the no-touch policy was a lie they could no longer sustain. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a shimmering ocean of black ties and silk gowns, but to Zara, it felt like a gladiator's pit. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying rot of unspoken threats. Beside her, Daehyun was a statue of silver and shadow, his tailored tuxedo hiding the bandages Zara had applied only nights before. He moved with a practiced grace, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back, a gesture that felt like a brand through the thin fabric of her dress. To the world, it was an act of possessive love. To them, it was a tactical formation. "Smile, Zara," Daehyun murmured, his lips barely moving as they approached the head table. "The Vipers are hungry tonight." The Vipers were led by Madame Park, the razor-tongued wife of the syndicate's most ambitious lieutenant. She sat draped in emeralds, her eyes tracking Zara's every movement with the precision of a predator looking for a limp. As the first course was served, the air at the table turned clinical. The men spoke in the coded language of shipping lanes and insurance, but Madame Park's focus remained domestic. "It is such a rarity to see Daehyun so captivated," Madame Park said, her voice a melodic poison. She leaned forward, her gaze dropping to where Zara's hand rested on Daehyun's arm. "Usually, he is so disciplined, so solitary. One wonders what magic a woman from so far away must possess to keep a man like him from his work." "It isn't magic, Madame Park," Zara replied, her voice steady, her unblinking gaze meeting the older woman's challenge. "It's simply that some men prefer a partner who understands the value of silence over the noise of the crowd." A few of the men chuckled, but Madame Park's smile didn't reach her eyes. She was a woman who made it her business to know the intimate secrets of the Han household. "Silence is lovely, but a house is very quiet without the sound of children. In our circle, a marriage without an heir is just a business merger, and rumors are such loud things, aren't they? They say the Han line has grown cold." The table went still. It was a direct strike at Daehyun's hidden shame, a public testing of the impotence rumor that could dismantle his authority. Zara felt the muscle in Daehyun's arm turn to stone beneath her touch. She knew he was a breath away from a reaction that would betray his insecurity. Zara didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in closer to Daehyun, her shoulder brushing his in a way that defied his no-touch rule but saved his pride. She let a small, knowing smile play on her lips, the kind of look shared by lovers who have spent the morning in bed. "Rumors are usually started by those who aren't invited behind closed doors," Zara said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried across the table. "Daehyun is many things, Madame Park, but cold is certainly not a word I would use to describe him in private. Perhaps you should spend less time listening to the help and more time tending to your own husband's interests. I hear his recent shipments have been underwhelming." The hit was perfect. Madame Park's face flushed a deep, mottled red as her husband stiffened beside her. Zara had turned the suspicion of infertility back into a question of professional incompetence. For the rest of the night, the Vipers remained silent, their venom neutralized by Zara's calculated boldness. As they finally retreated to the safety of the black sedan, the silence between them was heavy. Daehyun didn't pull his hand away immediately this time. He looked out the window at the passing lights of Seoul, his reflection caught in the glass. "You lied well," he said, his voice low and raspy. "I didn't lie about you being a partner," Zara replied, looking at her hands. "But next time, give me a warning before you throw me to the wolves." "You weren't thrown," Daehyun said, finally turning to look at her. "You were leading the pack." The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the Seoul skyline into a blurred smear of neon and gray. Inside, the only light came from the amber glow of a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the low-glass table. Daehyun sat on the floor, his back against the velvet sofa, his legs sprawled out. He had discarded his jacket and tie, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, exposing the jagged scars that wove through the ink on his chest. He looked less like a king and more like a ruin. Zara approached him quietly. She had traded her gala gown for a simple robe, the diamonds gone, leaving her feeling like herself again. She sat a respectful distance away, But the no-touch rule felt absurd after the battle they had fought at the dinner. The air was thick with the weight of the things unsaid. Madam Park was right about one thing, Dae-hyun said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. The Han line is cold, but it didn't start with me. He took a slow, deliberate swallow of the whiskey, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance. When I was 12, my father decided it was time I learned what loyalty meant. He didn't teach me with words. He taught me with a girl, a daughter of a rival clan he had captured. He told me that to rule, I had to be able to take what I wanted, when I wanted, regardless of the cost to others. He wanted to break the softness out of me. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She watched the way his jaw worked, the muscle jumping under the tattooed skin of his neck. I refused, Dae-hyun continued, a bitter smile twisting his lips. I looked him in the eye and told him no. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was showing him a better way to be a man. He laughed, a hollow, jagged sound. He didn't hit me. He didn't even yell. He just signaled his guards. He made me watch while they destroyed her. He told me that her blood was on my hands because I was too weak to take the burden myself. He told me that every time I looked at a woman, I should remember that my mercy was a death sentence. He set the glass down with a trembling hand. The mind is a strange thing, Zara. It builds walls you don't even know are there until you try to walk through them. Every time I've tried to be intimate since I became a man, I see her face. I see the blood. My body doesn't see a partner. It sees a crime scene. It shuts down to protect me from becoming the monster my father wanted me to be. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating blanket of shared trauma. Zara finally understood the silver cage. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress he had built around his own soul to keep the ghost of his father out. His impotence wasn't a physical failure. It was a moral protest that had frozen into a permanent state of being. Zara moved then, ignoring the rules, ignoring the contract. She slid off the sofa and sat beside him on the floor, her shoulder pressing firmly against his. She didn't try to pull him into an embrace. She simply offered the grounding weight of her presence. "You aren't your father, Dae-hyun," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. "And you didn't kill that girl. He did. He used your humanity as a weapon against you." Dae-hyun didn't pull away. For the first time, he leaned into the contact, his head dropping back against the sofa as he let out a long, shuddering breath. The monster of soul was gone. And in the quiet of the raining night, there were just two people sitting in the wreckage of a legacy, trying to figure out how to breathe. "Why are you still here?" he whispered. "You have enough for the debt. You could leave." Zara looked at the silver-haired man, seeing the scars and the ink and the heart he had tried so hard to bury. "Because," she said softly, "you're the first person who ever looked at me and didn't see someone to use. Even if you don't know it yet, you're the only one who sees me at all." The peace of the rainy night didn't fade. It was shattered. A dull, concussive thump vibrated through the floorboards, followed by the jagged scream of the estate's perimeter alarm. The floor-to-ceiling windows, which had been a canvas for the storm, suddenly reflected the rhythmic, artificial strobe of red emergency lights. Dae-hyun was on his feet before the sound had fully decayed, the vulnerability of the previous hour vanishing behind a mask of lethal intent. "Under the bed, the floor safe, get the vest," he barked, his voice no longer a whisper of confession, but a commander's rasp. Zara didn't waste breath on questions. She had lived a life of preparing for the worst. She simply moved. By the time she had retrieved the lightweight Kevlar, the sound of muffled gunfire was echoing from the floor below. The uncles hadn't waited for the rumors to be proven. They had decided to create a vacancy. Dae-hyun grabbed a hidden sidearm from the mahogany console, his tattooed fingers moving with a cold, mechanical precision that belied his internal scars. He grabbed Zara's hand, not with the possessiveness of the wedding or the clinical touch of the gala, but with the frantic grip of a man holding onto his only lifeline. They sprinted toward the back of the master suite, where a seamless panel in the walk-in closet slid open to reveal a reinforced steel door. They scrambled inside just as the bedroom's main door was kicked off its hinges. The sound of the safe room locking was a heavy, final thud that cut the world in two. Inside, the room was small, lit by the dim blue glow of security monitors. Zara slumped against the cold metal wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. On the screens, she watched grainy shadows, men in tactical gear, moving through their private sanctuary, tearing apart the silk sheets and shattering the glass tables. "They're in our room," she whispered, her eyes wide. Dae-hyun didn't look at the monitors. He was slumped against the opposite wall, his gun resting on his knee, his eyes fixed on Zara. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the raw, jagged edges of their conversation from before the attack. "They'll never get through that door," he said, though his voice lacked its usual iron. He looked at his shaking hands, the hands of a man who could kill to protect his empire but couldn't touch his wife to save his soul. "I'm sorry, Zara. I've brought the war to your doorstep." Zara looked at him, really looked at him in the flickering blue light. She saw the silver-haired boss, the impotent heir, and the terrified boy all at once. She moved across the small space, the distance between them vanishing until her knees brushed his. "Stop apologizing for being a target," she said, her voice echoing in the cramped chamber. "And stop acting like we're on opposite sides of a contract. They're out there trying to kill us. Not just the boss, and not just the maid. Us." Dae-hyun looked up, startled by the plural. "You're still talking like this is real." "Because it is," Zara replied, reaching out and firmly taking his shaking hand in hers. This time, she didn't wait for permission. She interlaced her fingers with his, forcing him to feel the steady beat of her pulse. "You told me your father used your humanity as a weapon. Well, use mine as a shield. We aren't just a performance anymore, Dae-hyun. We're an alliance." In the silence of the safe room, while the world outside tried to burn their life down, Dae-hyun's fingers finally stopped trembling. He squeezed her hand back, a slow, deliberate pressure. For the first time, but he didn't see a crime scene when he looked at a woman. He saw a partner. The no-touch rule hadn't just been breached, it had been incinerated. "An alliance," he repeated, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as he watched the monitors. "Then let's show them what happens when the monster and the maid stop playing parts." The smoke from the safe room attack had barely cleared before the true poison began to seep through the syndicate's ranks. It wasn't lead or fire this time, but a weapon far more surgical. A subpoena. Within 48 hours of the breach, the uncles had convened an emergency council, led by the opportunistic Elder Shin. They didn't come with guns, they came with a specialist, a renowned urologist and psychologist whose reputation for discerning the truth was a thinly veiled tool for corporate execution. The council chamber was a vault of cold stone and tradition, the air heavy with the scent of incense and old blood. Dae-hyun sat at the head of the long table, his silver hair swept back, his expression a mask of bored arrogance. Zara sat beside him, draped in a dress of midnight velvet, her hand resting over his on the table. The gold bands on their fingers caught the dim light, but Elder Shin wasn't looking at the jewelry. He was looking at the way Dae-hyun's pulse hammered in the hollow of his throat. "The safety of the Han group depends on the strength of its leader," Shin announced, his voice a dry rasp. "And strength is not merely found in the fist, it is found in the future, in the bloodline." He gestured toward the specialist, a man in a clinical white coat who stood like an inquisitor. "There are persistent rumors, nephew. Reports from a clinic you visited 3 years ago after your accident. We require a formal certification of your physical fitness to lead. An examination. Today." The room went cold. It was a move designed to strip Dae-hyun of his dignity and expose the secret that Zara had worked so hard to shield. If Dae-hyun refused, he admitted guilt. If he submitted, the specialist, already bought by Shin, would find exactly what he was paid to find, a failure of manhood that would justify a transition of power. Zara felt Dae-hyun's hand turn to ice beneath hers. The trauma of the safe room, the vulnerability they had shared, was being dragged into the light of a boardroom. She could see the wall of his psychological block rising, his eyes glazing over as he retreated into the numb silence that had protected him for a decade. A certification? Zara's voice cut through the tension like a piano wire. She didn't wait for Dae-hyun to find his footing. She stepped into the gap. She let out a small, sharp laugh that echoed with a perfect blend of insult and amusement. You want to send a doctor into our bedroom because you're bored with your own shipping manifests, Elder Shin? This is a matter of tradition, Zarasi. Shin countered, his eyes narrowing. Tradition is about honor, not voyeurism, Zara said, standing slowly and leaning over the table. She looked the specialist up and down with a clinical, dismissive disdain. Dae-hyun is the head of this family. If you want proof of his vitality, look at the men who tried to breach our home and are now lying in the city morgue. If you want proof of our marriage, you are looking at it. She turned back to the specialist, her gaze unblinking. But if you insist on a medical record, perhaps we should start with Elder Shin's. I've noticed he spends quite a bit of the group's funds on private nursing in the Ginza district. Should we call a council to discuss his fitness to manage our offshore accounts? The shift was instantaneous. The other lieutenants shifted in their seats, their eyes turning towards Shin. Zara had done what she did best. She had found the dust and turned the vacuum on. She pulled a folder from her clutch, the one she had spent the morning assembling with the help of a loyalist in the Han Group's accounting department. She didn't open it. She just tapped her fingers on the cover. We aren't here to be examined like livestock, Zara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. We are here to lead. If the council wishes to follow a man who spends more time investigating my husband's sheets than the enemies at our borders, then by all means, proceed. But know that when the Han Group falls, it won't be because of a lack of an heir. It will be because you were too busy looking at the past to see the wolves in the room. Dae-hyun finally looked up, his eyes clear, the fog of his trauma momentarily lifted by the sheer audacity of the woman beside him. He reached out and closed his hand over Zara's, standing to his full height. The examination is over, Dae-hyun said, his voice echoing with the authority of a king. Get out, all of you. Before I decide that Elder Shin's retirement starts tonight. As the council filed out in a flurry of hushed whispers and bruised egos, Zara and Dae-hyun were left alone in the stone chamber. The silence was different now. No longer a cage, but a bridge. But even as they shared a look of triumph, the shadow of a new threat loomed. Shin hadn't won the gambit, but the desperation in his eyes told Zara that the game was about to get much more violent. The betrayal didn't come from a boardroom subpoena this time. It came from the shadows Zara thought she had mastered. To finally bury Elder Shin, she had volunteered to go where Dae-hyun's tattoos and silver hair made him a beacon. The deep, subterranean levels of the Blue Dragon nightclub, where Shin kept the physical ledgers of his offshore treason. She had gone undercover as a simple cleaner, slipping back into the invisibility of her old life. But invisibility is a double-edged sword. When the communication line in her ear went dead, the silence wasn't a tactical choice, it was a trap. By the time Dae-hyun realized the signal had been jammed, Zara was already being held in the windowless sub-basement of the club. Shin's men hadn't just caught a spy. They had caught the one thing the monster of soul actually valued. Dae-hyun stood at the perimeter of the club, his breathing shallow and jagged. The neon lights of the district pulsed like a headache, but as he moved toward the service entrance, the old, cold, familiar ghost rose up to meet him. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, not from fear of the guns, but from the paralyzing memory of his father's study. His mind began to flicker with the image of that girl from years ago, the one he hadn't saved. The walls were closing in, and the psychological block freezing his limbs until his fingers felt like lead. If you enter, you will fail her. Everyone you look at ends up broken. Inside the basement, Zara was tied to a steel chair, her lips split, but her gaze still unblinking as Shin leaned over her. He isn't coming, child. The old man sneered, tapping a heavy ring against the table. He's a man who can't even claim his own wife. Do you really think he'll claim a war for a maid? He isn't a man who claims things, Zara spat, tasting iron. He's a man who protects them. And you've made the mistake of touching something he considers his. Suddenly, the steel door of the basement didn't just open, it was purged from its hinges. Daehyun didn't enter with a shout. He entered with a silence so profound it felt heavier than a scream. His silver hair was disheveled, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and lethal clarity. For a second, the phantom of his father's voice whispered in his ear, "Look at the blood. It's your fault." But then he looked at Zara. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the way she was still fighting even while bound. She wasn't a victim from his past. She was his partner in the present. The block didn't shatter. It dissolved under the heat of a singular, protective rage. "Get away from her," Daehyun said, his voice a low, predatory rumble that vibrated in the small room. Shin's guards moved, but they were slow compared to a man who had finally stopped fighting himself. Daehyun moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, his tattooed fists becoming the weapons his father always wanted, but wielded for a reason his father could never understand. He didn't see a crime scene anymore. He saw a clearing. Within minutes, the room was quiet again, the guards incapacitated and Shin cowering in the corner. Daehyun didn't go for the ledgers first. He went for Zara. His hands were shaking, but as he knelt to cut her zip ties, he didn't pull away when her skin brushed his. He leaned into it. He gripped her wrists, checking for marks, his touch frantic and real. "I thought I was too late," he whispered, his forehead dropping to hers. "I thought the ghost had won." Zara reached up, her fingers grazing the dragon on his neck, pulling him into the first genuine, desperate embrace they had ever shared. "The ghosts only win if you let them dance alone, Daehyun. I'm not going anywhere." In the damp, dark basement of a criminal's club, the lion finally roared, not for power, but for the woman who had taught him how to breathe again. The evidence was in their hands, and the throne was finally within sight. The cleansing of the Han group did not happen with a grand massacre, but with a clinical, terrifying precision. In the weeks following the Blue Dragon incident, the uncles who had conspired with Elder Shin found themselves summoned one by one to the Stone Council chamber. They arrived expecting a trial. They found a coronation. Daehyun and Zara sat side by side, no longer separated by the artificial distance of a contract or the cold rules of a no-touch policy. They were a singular front, a union of silver and shadow that the syndicate had never seen. Daehyun moved with a new kind of authority, one that didn't rely on the performative cruelty of his father. With Zara at his right hand, he systematically purged the disloyal, replacing the stagnant corruption of the old guard with a structure built on the very dignity under pressure Zara had brought into his home. Those who had mocked the marriage found themselves staring into the eyes of a man who was no longer hiding a secret, but wielding a truth. The rumors of his impotence died in the throats of his enemies, silenced by the visible, undeniable chemistry of a couple that had survived the fire together. But it was within the walls of the penthouse that the real revolution took place. The silver cage had been opened. The glass tables and sterile chrome remained, but the air was different. It was warm, filled with the music Zara loved and the scent of the home she had helped him build. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the Seoul skyline, Daehyun stood by the window, watching the flakes descend. He didn't look like a ruin anymore. Zara approached him, not as a maid or a contractor, but as a wife. She didn't hesitate as she stepped into his space, her hand sliding naturally into his. This time, there was no tremor in his fingers, no phantom of a girl from 30 years ago standing between them. When he turned to her, his silver hair backlit by the city lights, his gaze was clear and focused. "I spent my whole life thinking the ink on my skin was a warning," he said softly, his thumb tracing the gold band on Zara's finger. "A reminder of what I couldn't be. I didn't think I could ever be a husband. Not really." "The ink is just a story, Daehyun," Zara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder, letting her weight rest fully against him. "And stories can be rewritten." He turned fully toward her, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that made the monster of soul feel like a distant myth. The psychological walls that had frozen his heart for a decade hadn't just been breached. They had been dismantled by the simple, persistent warmth of a woman who refused to blink. In the quiet of their room, the marriage